Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your presence here. I think we're going to have a very instructive, but also very interesting afternoon. We are living in an age of transformation and disruption. Almost all of the features of the post-1945 world, the UN, World Courts, the EU, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Health Organization, even NATO, seem to be driven by new divisions and by serious disagreements about their purpose. In the US, in Europe, throughout the Anglosphere, we've seen popular and populist electoral rebellions against remote elites in cities like Washington and Brussels. We've seen the emergence of new political parties. The Republican Party, for instance, is a very different party in reality, under the same name, from what the GOP was in 2012. The attempt by global elites to impose policies of mass migration, gender theory, multiculturalism, open borders on their populations, often without any serious democratic debate, has resulted in these kind of rebellions, and the process has not stopped. It's at a time like this that one needs institutions that can stand back and look critically, skeptically even, at existing policies and propose new ones to adapt to these new challenges. If we're going to triumph over existing crises and divisions, we need institutions that can persuasively and credibly propose new solutions and responses. In a way, a highly specialized way, an organization called the Office of Net Assessment performed those kind of tasks for the Pentagon and the United States during the Cold War. And it did so very well. We all remember how the Cold War ended. But its mission was changed drastically when the Obama administration arrived in 2009, gave it the task not of safeguarding US primacy in global politics, but of adapting US policy to be one of several powers in a multilateral world. A cynic might say that President Obama's new Net Assessment Office of those times succeeded all too well in this task. We're living in a post-Obama and post-Biden world in which American primacy is in retreat. And not only is the West more divided, but a formidable alliance of Russia, China, North Korea, and other authoritarian and other groupings like the BRICS and the economic alliance are emerging more strongly. That is not the taste of the new president, who plainly would like to reassert US primacy, and is doing so in ways that sometimes strikes his allies as disruptive. In Europe, in North Canada, in North America and Canada. What kind of response is likely to emerge from President Trump's new administration? He is someone, after all, who has found America's national security state to be a formidable problem in American domestic politics, and a problem not always on his side. Adam Lovinger currently serves as Vice President of Strategic Affairs and at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, a US-based, DC-based think and do tank. But in 2017, he served as the Senior Director for Strategic Assessments at the US National Security Council, where we have, in fact, two formidable critics here, able to guide us through the bureaucratic maze of national security politics in America and of global politics everywhere else. You have, in the invitation you received, a full account, a reasonably full account of a very distinguished career that Mr. Lovinger has so far enjoyed, and which is likely, I think, to continue to greater distinction in the future. I'm also very delighted to welcome, for the home team, so to speak, the friend of the Institute, the editor of the Hungarian Review, editor-in-chief, and of the Hungarian Conservative, a former ambassador to Ireland, but relevant on this occasion, I think in particular, the most distinguished Americanist in Hungarian academic life. Tamás Magyarich is his name, and I'd like to thank both of them for being present. I'm going to ask Adam Lovinger to begin, give his talk. For a first response, I'll turn to Tamás, and then the floor will be open to you. Adam.
Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been very impressed with the week that I've so far been here in Hungary. As John and I were talking about earlier, I think that oftentimes foreigners, or at least people who are some distance away from events, can actually see things more clearly than those of us who are in the midst of them. And I've actually just learned a lot here, both from some Danube Institute fellows, as well as my hosts at the Hungarian Institute for International Affairs, where I'm a visiting fellow. The topic of our conversation is President Donald Trump and the national security state. I think this is relevant for our times for reasons that John alluded to. He mentioned there's a lot of ferment and upheaval in the world, but as I'm sure all of you know here, sitting in this room, there's also tremendous upheaval in my own country. In my town where I live, Washington, D.C., I have neighbors when I walk my dog who won't talk to me anymore because I worked for the first Trump White House and remain close to the administration. And there is the venom in their eyes is rather palpable. Washington, D.C. is really being turned upside down at this moment, with agencies that are being dismantled, with my home office at the Pentagon. The Office of Net Assessment was disestablished just several weeks ago after existing for over half a century. And this upheaval, I've got the benefit of some understanding from some Danube Institute fellows the other evening over a very delicious cherry beer, which I've never had before, but it really lubricated the conversation. And the concept that we were talking about is late-stage empire. Very interesting topic, and we were debating about whether is the United States in the stages of late-stage empire. Well, I think that that's actually, in some respects, the question of the day. The arguments for that are that, well, you see this decline, as John has alluded to, this retrenchment, and many of the qualities, for example, the late Roman Empire are on display. You have the British Empire, the wary Titan of the early 20th century, also as a model, where we see this sort of slow decline. And I think someone quoted Ernest Hemingway that, like bankruptcy, it first happens slowly and then happens all at once. And so the question is this indeed where the United States is right now? To step back and give you a little bit of the perspective that I'm coming from, and by the way, I think it remains to be seen whether this is indeed the direction of the United States. As John alluded to, something rather dramatic happened in 2009 when I was brought into the Pentagon to serve in this high-level strategy office called the Office of Net Assessment in 2004. The notion that America would be upholding and preserving U.S. global primacy long-term was a given. And that doesn't mean that America wanted to rule the world, far from it. America's never wanted to rule the world, and we've been very reluctant about doing that. But the idea is that what does primacy mean? It means the most powerful power in the world, and that's to uphold classic liberal values and the values that undergird the American constitutional order, including supporting our friends and democratic allies such as Hungary and other countries, and ensuring the rule of law, classical liberal values. This was what was assumed. Obama, who got a Nobel Peace Prize before he actually had done anything, I think in many respects, many Americans, including many people in my family, voted for him because they put hope on him. I mean, he was a great symbol that we'd overcome our race divisions of the past, and he seemed like a young, hopeful person. What he did, though, I believe he set in motion a series of events that we're feeling to this day, which are highly pernicious, perhaps the most pernicious in the history of the United States. And what I mean specifically by that is we got some early indications of that in 2009, as John alluded to, when Obama decided to go out through the world on what has become called his apology tour. He went around the world and he apologized for the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, from the land of France, where many tens of thousands of American soldiers had died. He apologized in Strasbourg, France, for what America had done historically in promoting its interests, which he framed in a rather sort of imperial light. He also criticized our democratic allies like Israel, comparing Israel's treatment of Arabs to America's treatment of blacks during slavery. By the time Obama got home, his national polling had really gone down significantly. Americans, no matter what their stripe, even those on the left, don't really like it when their president goes abroad and criticizes America. That's sort of a little bit beyond the pale. You can do that at home, you can work on things at home, but particularly in the first year of presidency, don't go forth and try to triangulate the world against the American people. So his polling went down. How did he respond to that? Well, traditionally, when an American president's polling goes down, he sort of tries to figure out why that's the case and fixes it, and oftentimes engages in a rather robust public debate. Well, that's not what he did. Instead, he decided to accomplish what is called the Obama Doctrine, which is sort of a policy of U.S. diminishment, clandestinely, from the inside. In 2015, Hillary Clinton was asked about this, and she said, yes, we don't believe you change hearts and minds. You change laws. You change the allocation of resources. You change the way systems operate. And what she was referring to was a rather sort of Gramscian, Alinskyite view of, let's not do the traditional American thing where we go out into the public square and have a robust debate, and in the tradition of the British Enlightenment, we come to a better understanding of truth and wise policy decisions. Let's secretly, beyond the views of the ordinary American, let's do this behind closed doors. Let's transform America internally, secretively. Hungary, with its experience of being under the Soviet boot, might know something about that. So, those of you in this room are probably too young to remember. I was just in the National Museum, and there was quite a harrowing exhibit of how Hungary was transformed into more of a Soviet state. But this is something that I think, when I looked going through that exhibit, I saw a lot of parallels with what happened under the Obama administration. So, what did I see? So, the transformation from George W. Bush administration to Obama, the office that I was in, called the Office of Net Assessment, it was transformed. The office, I would call it the highest level strategy office in the Pentagon. I'd actually call it the highest level strategy office in the whole United States government, just because of the centrality of our Defense Department in terms of national security policy. The office was really transformed. In 2011, Obama tried to shut the office down. He didn't believe in its mission of American primacy. 2013, he did the same thing. Didn't believe in it. Finally, he decided to decapitate it. He fired my legendary boss, Andrew W. Marshall, who was one of those brilliant American strategists in our history. And he put in place someone who was not qualified, and saw it really as his job to execute on the Obama doctrine, which is a doctrine of U.S. diminishment. His name is James H. Baker. He was recently fired, actually 2 weeks ago, which was a great cause of celebration for myself and others. Very pernicious character. I wrote a book about what he did and what the office went through, called The Insider Threat: How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. You're very welcome to read it. Published by Encounter Press. Roger Kimball, who's a mutual friend of both John and myself. So Obama put in place his political operatives, his ideological operatives inside key positions inside the U.S. national security strategy to advance his doctrine. I use the term in my book titled Deep State. This is a term which I was very reluctant to use because it sounds like maybe a conspiracy theory or something, and some rather strange people who don't seem very credible, they use this term. I was reluctant to use it. But what I observed of the deep state, I can tell you, which is the deep state as I see it are sort of precisely what Hillary Clinton admitted to in 2015, which is that you sort of you identify certain nodes, certain offices that do specialized things within the U.S. national security bureaucracy, and you capture them. You get your people in there, you ensure that the leadership of that office, if it ever has to go for some reason, you put your people back in that office. What did I see firsthand? I saw offices that were in charge of personnel. This is in the Pentagon. Security clearances, administrative law judge, the inspectors general, various sort of boring offices, but when you sort of piece them together and you look at what do these offices do together, they can genuinely be weaponized. If you are controlling them and the facts and the law don't matter, which we came to see, particularly in Russiagate, that the facts and the law did not matter, if you piece these offices together and you weaponize them, you can cause tremendous damage and you can genuinely create more of a Soviet state inside the national security bureaucracy. So this is something that was happening. An aspect of Russiagate, which is not very well known, and I put it in my book, is that this was not really an outgrowth of the FBI. It began in the year 2010 in the Office of Net Assessment, where I spent 14 years. I saw it develop firsthand. And the way it developed was you first had the corruption of the office, and then there was an ideological subversion. And when you have corruption tied with ideological subversion, the ideological subversion in question was, U.S. diminishment, which just so happens to be America's enemy's objectives as well. You get genuine foreign infiltration. And so between the year 2010 and 2016, a gentleman by the name of Stefan Halper, who was known before then as the world's most infamous presidential elections interference operative, he teamed up on contracts led by this office with the former head of Russian intelligence, General V.I. Trubnikov. The reason for this was that it is the institutional infrastructure that Russiagate would be built upon. And what I mean by that is this. When you look at Russiagate, what happened there? Well, it was Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee. They were working with Perkins Coie law firm, which was working with Fusion GPS, which was working with Christopher Steele. Christopher Steele had some Russian people working for him, but also Stefan Halper and the former head of Russian Foreign Intelligence, Trubnikov. Hillary Clinton, why was she involved in Russiagate? Two primary reasons. One was to deflect attention away from her computer use of classified information on her private server. She wanted to definitely wanted that problem to go away because it was very much tied up with how she was leveraging her political office for private financial gain for the Clinton Foundation. That's something we all know. The Department of Justice Inspector General did a report on that. It's very clear. But the second thing that she was, doing with Russiagate was to target President Trump's inside advisors. Let me just back up a little bit here. These contracts led by the Office of NSS between 2010 and 2016, what was their purpose? How did they help Hillary Clinton? They helped her because of this. She knew that the deep sources for the Steele dossier were Russian intelligence. If anyone was ever going to ask her, why did you, Hillary Clinton, rely upon Stefan Halper and the former head of Russian intelligence for your sourcing? She could go back and say, oh, well, look, the US Department of Defense between the year 2010 and 2016 relied on the very same sources. How reasonable that is. This is sort of, what I'm describing here is rather sophisticated tradecraft of how one weaponizes the national security bureaucracy. And this is, of course, what Trump walked into when he was elected. I had been working between 2006 and 2016 very closely with Trump's first national security advisor, General Mike Flynn. Mike Flynn, some people consider the most brilliant intelligence, Army intelligence officer of his generation. He's extremely talented in that regard. Why were we communicating? He was in battlefield intelligence, primarily in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was not the highest level strategy officer at the Pentagon. We were communicating because we were disturbed by the same pathologies. The pathologies that America did not have strategies to win these wars. There was some deep reason that we were in these wars for 20 years. We never had strategies to win them. We came to the same conclusion. The conclusion was that if you win the war, the contract funding dries up. Wars are very lucrative. I went to Washington to go to law school in 1998. Between 1998 and 2006, even later, Washington transformed from a rather small southern city to quite a wealthy metropolis. This is what war does. Creates a lot of profit, number one. Number two, building bureaucratic empires. Wars, if you're an ambitious general or an ambitious military officer, an ambitious bureaucrat, you can build your career on war because funding for your empire, your empire grows big. There's that. So Flynn and I were, both appalled by this. In the year 2014, several years before the Trump came to office, I was tasked by my late boss, Andrew Marshall, to identify what were the pathologies for why America lost its national security capacity. I was not treated very well in the Pentagon. Most people didn't want me, looking, under the covers to see what sort of corruption was going on there. But I was tolerated. When Trump won and Flynn brought me to the National Security Council, that's kind of when all hell broke loose. I had a pristine career before then. I had 5 investigations immediately launched against me. Both Flynn and I experienced what happens when the national security state decides they don't like you anymore. It's called the weaponization of the federal investigative process. You want to destroy someone, you investigate them, and you keep investigating them until you either find something or you can generate some lies that you can destroy their career on. This happened to both Flynn and me. I'm not very important. He was more important. What made him so important? Trump was an outsider. He was not a creature of Washington. He sort of came in from the outside and won the election. A surprise. I think it even surprised him. What made him so dangerous, though, was he was an outsider who was not corrupted already by Washington. many leaders in Washington, I don't know how it works here, but many, presidential candidates, they have to weave their way up the sort of, as Disraeli called it, the slippery slope, the slippery pole, and get rather compromised along the way. Trump didn't have that. He could really approach, he had no vested interests in the Washington swamp, the deep state. He parachuted in. What made him so dangerous, though, was that he brought in real insiders who were appalled by the corruption, appalled by the foreign interference, influence in undermining America from within. And so that's where the deep state went after us. Flynn, primarily, he was actually target number one, myself secondarily, and some others who were doing the work that Flynn wanted us to do. So that's the upheaval that we experienced on the inside. Where does that bring us to today? Trump learned a lot in his first administration. We then had 4 years to sort of do an after-action report, look what the hell happened during the 4 years of the Biden administration. We studied it. I wrote my book. Number one, to understand how is it that America, which is supposed to be a nation based upon the rule of law, can be so lawless, and those criminals that knowingly and willfully violate the law, weaponize the federal investigative process, whether it's John Brennan or James Comey or Clapper or, any number of these, really horrendous people that sort of are more Soviet than American. How can this exist? This was a shock to me as a lawyer. I didn't think this could exist. I wrote my book also as a form of psychological therapy because I was just so shocked this could happen in America. I didn't think it could. But those 4 years were very fruitful. The conclusions of Trump and his advisors was that there is this massive internal rot in our government. And I'm very refreshed and happy to see that so many of these corrupt agencies and offices are being disbanded. Trump said he would do this. Coming back to some of the brilliant researchers affiliated with the Hungarian Institute for International Affairs and the Danube Institute, who introduced me to the concept of late-stage empires. Just maybe, this cleaning out the Augean stables with Doge and Trump's policies to clean up the national security state and the weaponization of government. Maybe this will bear some fruit, and we will not go the way of these once expired great powers. I hope that Otto von Bismarck was correct, that God holds special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. That's something that we will all wait to see. But I think we're on a good start, and with that, I'll end my initial presentation.
Yeah, George, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry, Adam, because we have a mutual friend in George. Well, thank you very much indeed. You covered a lot of ground there, and I just want to mention to all of you that Adam, in a podcast this morning, which will be released relatively soon, I think, with Gavin Haynes, also covered somewhat different ground about the background to the early days of the Office of Net Assessment, which I recommend to you all. So this makes a nice 1-2 punch, so to speak. Thank you. And Tamas, perhaps I can now turn to you. I gather you have been discussing Hungary's response to America's new foreign policy yourself only the other day.
Thank you very much. I'm a first responder instead of USAID here, as the organization is suspended right at the moment. I've got very few comments and just impressionistic remarks listening to Adam. First of all, I'd like to comment on this deep state sort of idea. The deep state, I was teaching at universities for 40 years, and there was a textbook case how the US government is working or should be working, the three branches of government and so on. In fact, in reality, that's not the case. So you have too many different actors over there. Sometimes the media is regarded to be the fourth branch of the government. Then of course, you have the interest groups or the lobbies. You have the so-called iron triangle, the bureaucracy, legislation, and different interest groups. And of course, you have this very prosaic sort of modus operandi in Congress. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. So the bridge to nowhere in Alaska and so on. So that is how the budget is ballooning and hitting the roof, even going through the roof every year. The deep state is a very complex issue, and as a historian, I think that half of the presidents in the past couple of decades were running against Washington, wanted to drive the swamp, so to say. We can go back to Jimmy Carter, died last year, age 100. And he came from Georgia, bringing over all the Georgia people, Georgia clan, and some people suggest that that was one of the problems he had. So he alienated a lot of vested interest in Washington D.C., putting all the Georgians into key positions. So he was an outsider. Ronald Reagan was also an outsider for different reasons, but he also wanted to drive the swamp, the sort of small government instead of the big government and so on. Bill Clinton was also running against Washington, coming from a small state. And interestingly, Barack Obama was running against Washington to a certain extent. And here I'd just like to suggest that there is more continuity between Obama and Trump than meets the eye. So I'd like to make a case with regard to foreign policy as well. But he was running against Washington, but he became Washington, so to say, after some times. He was simply becoming a symbol of the liberal Washingtonian establishment, despite the fact that one of the major actors over there, the Clintons, weren't quite on the same page with Obama all the time. And it's a little bit ironic reading Hillary Clinton's memoirs, and she was talking about all those hundreds of thousands of miles she was traveling. In fact, the Obama people wanted to see him outside of Washington, not inside Washington, because they suspected that the Clintons wanted to take revenge of being defeated in 2008. So the deep state has been there, and if you talk about the active participation of the deep state against one president, then Richard Nixon comes to my mind. And I guess that the Watergate scandal is quite a well-known story. And there, the two journalists, Carpus and Woodward, sometimes simply hit the wall, so they didn't know where to go from point A to point B. And then there was the deep throat, which actually turned out to be a special agent of the FBI, Mark Felt. And Richard Nixon has been, or had been, in the crosshairs of the liberals since the 1940s, when he defeated two liberal icons in California politics. So it was to a certain extent their revenge against Nixon. And it wasn't just the FBI, but the CIA as well, the white male Yale sort of people, and Nixon was also outsider, so to say. So that's about the deep state and outsiders. Now, my proposition that there is more continuity between Obama and Trump than one would think at first sight. First of all, I guess that Obama was a closet real politician. So he had this famous comment of saying, "Don't do stupid stuff." But then, leading from behind, actually it was one of the advisors who used this term with regard to Libya, that he was the one who actually rebalanced the US, that is, rebalanced US interests from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I know it's bad news for the Europeans, but Europe has been downgraded in the past 30 years or so in American politics since the early 1990s, and the Indian Pacific Ocean has become the most important strategic area for the US. Yeah, that's exactly what Trump is believing. So Trump is trying to shift the burden of neighborhood security onto the shoulders of the Europeans. But I'd like to remind you that it was the Obama administration in 2014 at the Wells NATO summit that first demanded that Europeans spend 2% of the GDP on defense. And then there was Robert Gates, 2011, the Secretary of Defense at the time, who was delivering his farewell speech in Brussels, warning against a sort of a gap opening between the Europeans and the Americans with regard to strategy, with regard to capability, with regard to ability, with regard to weapon showing, so to say. So the current Trump tough love sort of approach is not new. But Obama was more polite, so to say, and he was a sort of pop star here. I remember when he came here as a presidential candidate, he was given a tremendous welcome in Berlin around the Siegersäule. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out to watch Obama. As a matter of fact, not too many people remember what he actually said, but he was speaking very beautifully, and people loved him. So, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that what we're seeing right now is not absolutely new. Of course, it's a bit more naked, more rough, rough and tumble, and so on. But all of these differences between the president, the White House, the national security state, so to say, and certain vested interests have been there all along. But the difference is that previously these fights were taking place behind the scenes, right now in front of the scenes. So, on the other hand, I don't want to say that everything is good old business and business as usual, but continuity is a very important factor in this whole story.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm going to ask a question, but before I do, would you like to come back at all on anything that Tamás said?
Yeah, just briefly. It's Friday afternoon, after lunch. Some of you might be sort of thinking about the weekend and getting a little bit tired, so I'm going to wake you up by radically disagreeing with my friend here. Just because I don't want anyone to fall asleep and we have to keep you entertained. Obama was a fundamental break with U.S. history. How so? We know, and you Hungarians in here who experienced Soviet Union, we know that the Soviets really started working on dividing and conquering America from within. You know, Trotsky, 1917, New York City, he was probably the originator, but the infiltration of American institutions, a recognition by the Soviets, and then as the Chinese rose in power and recognized they didn't want to go the way the Soviet Union collapsed, they recognized the opportunities. Look how open America is. America is ripe for the picking. We can take candy from these babies. America is so open, a little bit of money, a little bit of corruption, a little bit of compromise can go a very, very long way. So what does this have to do with Obama? You've watched from here what's happened on American university campuses, the Ivy League, my alma mater, Columbia University, where you have American students protesting against the United States of America, supporting terrorist organizations paid for by the Chinese and the Qataris first. This is foreign infiltration. Barack Obama, you look at his background. This is not the Clintons. Obama was really different. Doesn't like America. Thinks, you go on the Obama Foundation website today, the very first sentence you will read is, "We believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion." What does this mean? Diversity is a throwaway. It means nothing. The key is equity. You bring everybody down. If you have a preeminent America, that is not equity. You cut America's wings. You bring it down, you undermine it. If you look at the Russian strategic documents that were crafted after the fall of the Soviet Union, year after year after year, they say the same thing. We want a multilateral world. We do not want this hegemonic America. We want more freedom. We want balance of power. Balance of power is the key here. Balance of power is equity. Obama was pursuing Russian foreign policy objectives. Make no mistake about it. Whether he really, knew that he wanted, or whether these kids on American college campuses really, know that they're doing the bidding of America's enemies, they may not. Maybe they're just stupid, useful idiots. Who knows? But America's enemies are smiling. Sinwar, the head of Hamas before he was thankfully eliminated, thanked Columbia University students for their support. This is what Obama believes. He supported the strategic objectives of America's enemies, and he worked with the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians. The Iran deal was about equity. It was about balancing a nuclear Israel with a nuclear Iran. This was the strategic objective of the sunset clauses in the JCPOA. Obama's worldview is very consistent, and it is a radical, radical shift from the past.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask a question and then throw it open to the floor, because both speakers can come back at various points. And Thomas, you may want to come back on what Alan just said. But first of all, I want to offer not a definition exactly, but if we're talking about the deep state, I want to remind people of a remark made by a Supreme Court justice about obscenity and adapt it to this, because several people have more or less agreed that the deep state is something that everyone knows exists and what it is, but no one can quite define it. And I think that probably there's something in that. The second thing I want to say is this. I want to, because after all we are at the moment in Hungary, and there is one of the developing arguments being produced by the administration, which we heard very clearly in the address that J.D. Vance, the Vice President, gave in Europe when he addressed NATO, the European allies. And it was, in effect, an accusation that the campaign against disinformation was being transformed into a censorship industrial complex that was, in a sense, cracking down, disallowing demonizing free speech throughout the world, but particularly in Europe. And that this was, and now that the new administration, the Biden administration, by the way, had been fully part of this in various ways, but the new administration was against it. And in that speech created an enormous ruckus. I should say that, of course, there were some European countries, we're in one, in which the government sympathized with Vance. And I would add that there are several countries, I think this one again, but also several countries in Central Europe, and I would say Britain too, in which large numbers of the population and the voters sympathize with Vance. So really I would like to ask Adam at this point to tell us how he thinks this has happened, this particular eruption of difference, and secondly, how he thinks the administration is going to pursue this and how it's going to play out.
Yeah, so, thankfully, the enemies of freedom are very consistent in their tactics, and they're actually not very creative. They look to, Soviet secret police as to how, they clamp down on freedom of expression, etc. This is really, what's happening again. The freedom of speech, open expression, going against the politically correct, the DEI mantra. This is, it's an existential threat for the West. We must have free speech. Like the other things I spoke about, doing the bidding for America's adversaries for them, I put this speech issue, under that umbrella. It's exactly, you look at, coming back to my alma mater, Columbia University, where critical theory emerged, which then transformed into critical race theory, which transformed into critical legal theory. What is the criticism? The criticism is you shut the other side down. You shut them down. This is very Soviet. The Russians supported these programs at my alma mater, Columbia University, as they did throughout the United States. They want to shut down the conservative voice, the voice that believes in the ideals of the American Republic, the founders, the Enlightenment thinking that went into our constitutional order, where in the Federalist Papers you had America's founders talk about the importance of the system and the workings of the system, where you have the three branches of government coming together, clashing, getting wisdom, getting light, getting new policy differences. The left wants to shut this down, just as the Soviets wanted to do, just here in Hungary after 1956, even before that. It's the same tactics. They're not very imaginative. So I think I support what J.D. Vance had to say. I'm thrilled for the most part of Hungary's response to that. And I really do hope that the rest of Europe wakes up, that these classical liberal values such as free speech are safeguarded.
Thank you.
Free speech is really a difficult issue, much like the deep state, how to define it. And of course, in the US, the yardstick is this clear and present danger Supreme Court ruling from the late 1910s. Crying fire in a crowded theater or crying fire in an open field. There's a difference between the two. And also, more recently, this Facebook story to suppress certain contents or to suppress certain contents. Mark Zuckerberg admitted that the Biden administration people put pressure on them to suppress certain contents. And then we can even go back not to 1990, but the ancient times, Plato, who is guarding the gods. So who is deciding what is offensive and what is actually hurting the interest of or even the security of certain groups. Here we had this story with Harvard University chanting anti-Semitic slogans. And then the then president of chancellor of the university made this testimony in Congress saying that, well, it depends on the context. What context? But chanting anti-Semitic slogans, especially after World War II, it's very difficult to imagine any context which might be permissible, especially due to the sea and so on. So this free speech is really a difficult issue. And second, disinformation, information. So sometimes information proved to be disinformation later on, and disinformation at first sight proved to be real information later on. So, but we have to draw a line somewhere, and of course there are certain rules, red lines. But it's more and more difficult to have the red lines with social media. More and more difficult to have to go after people because you can text messages from Greenland. Though Greenland is quite sensitive at the moment, but Patagonia, I don't think that Patagonia is directed by the Trump administration right at the moment, but from anywhere, very difficult to keep track of all of these messages, and allegedly this pro-Trump or sort of disinformation messages came from Russian sources, allegedly. Yes or no, whether it was true or not, difficult to say. So let me tell you, I'm not a computer wizard. As a matter of fact, I'm not on any of these social media stuff. So I have misgivings about the beneficial influence of all of these people expressing themselves freely and spreading all sorts of misinformation, stupidity, slander, and so on. But anyway,
Okay, thank you. Now, let me throw questions over to the floor. Yes, gentleman here. Oh, sorry. Do we have a mic? Will you take a mic? And thanks.
And then we can share.
We can share. And would you pass it on to the next person, maybe?
Sure. Thanks very much. My name is Stephen Agnew. I'm a professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo, but a Canadian with Hungarian descent, so complicated. I have a couple questions, and one revolves around this idea of the deep state. You know, I consult with government a lot. I do high-level analysis. I'm not sure I would be described as deep state. So where is that place for experts that have high-level knowledge that should be deployed in informing our political leaders about an informed assessment of whether it's the problems with the 51st state or Putin or China? I feel like I couldn't grasp a correct definition or an understanding of that place. And my second question revolves around this idea of freedom of speech. And I'm a firm believer of freedom of speech, but I think social media and certain adversaries have very much weaponized freedom of speech. And it's very hard for our young people to distinguish between what is true and what is not, and especially when our political leaders are also using not really fact-based opinions in the discussion. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your views about, where we move forward on freedom of speech. What is the appropriate ways of speaking, especially political leaders, because ultimately they set the tone for how our societies understand problems. Thank you.
So maybe I'll take the first part, which is the deep state, and you guys can talk about freedom of speech. So you all have my tremendous sympathy. And what I mean by that is that there is no one established definition of the deep state. The definition that I used is what I saw firsthand. I don't think that all bureaucrats are deep state. I think that the lawful ones, the ones that go about doing their job properly, I think they're part of the administrative state. As I define the deep state, I define it as a lawless, genuine conspiracy. And I say the conspiracy part with a little bit of hesitation, just because I'm a student of politics, I'm a lawyer. Conspiracies are very hard things to keep going, but I've seen the mechanisms firsthand about how they keep these conspiracies going. Number one, they do not promote anybody unless they have blackmail material on them. If you're going to be part of this conspiracy, we're only going to promote you if we can blackmail you. This is very CIA, this is very national security bureaucracy stuff. So there's that. The whole idea is to create mechanisms to prevent defection from the conspiracy. And another one of those mechanisms is you don't want it to be too big. You want to focus just on capturing certain key nodes. The bigger it gets, and even when I had 5 investigations weaponized against me, these people accusing me made lots of mistakes. One person was like, "Oh, you mishandled classified information." The other person was like, "No, he didn't." It's like my accusers were like, they were confused about what they were going to charge me with. So it's difficult. Like any sort of conspiracy, the bigger you get it, the harder it is to keep it going. So I think this is one of the lessons learned by these criminals, frankly, because they're knowingly and willfully subverting federal process. That's a crime. What they've learned is you keep it small, you keep it hyper-empowered, you just conquer key nodes. And fortunately, Russiagate was a tremendous view into how they did this. Where were the key people? What roles did they play? Same thing in my case, you laid out in my book. We got an absolute treasure trove of deep state tradecraft. I'll give you one juicy example before I turn it over. Another way of controlling the conspiracy is that my chief accusers were rather senior. They directed their subordinates, military officers, to target me with illegal investigations. And then they gave them an insurance policy that would protect them. And that insurance policy was that they gave them after they weaponized these investigations against me, the senior deep state operatives gave their subordinate prestigious medals, the Defense Superior Service Medal. And in the medal, what do? They write in the citation, the actual narrative, so-and-so conducted these investigations with the most integrity and lawfulness. Everything was perfect. There was nothing wrong, blah, 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 blah. Essentially turning reality on its head and issuing it on behalf of the United States Department of Defense, so that if they were ever questioned about their criminal weaponization of federal investigative processes, they could say, "Oh, look, here's my medal, a very high medal, one of the highest in the land, that are given to soldiers for valor on the battlefield. And look, it says everything I did was right." And they know, cynically, that the US Department of Defense will back them 100% because because institutionally, it's a too big to fail dynamic they create. This is how cynical they are. But these are some of the tricks that they use, the dirty tricks they use to perpetuate the conspiracy.
Good, thank you. Would you like to respond to either side? No?
Well, just a very brief, almost anecdotal examples of deep state. First of all, what address you have, so where you live. Georgetown said people or not, so it's Oscar Wilde's right side of the street or wrong side of the street wherever you are born. Then this sort of informal group, like Chuck Todd, the NBC anchor, writing a book saying that, well, for 4 years we were lying, basically, about the Biden administration, but it was part of parcel of this whole machinery. Or this story in Jared Kushner's memoirs about Van Jones, CNN anchor. He had to talk to Van Jones to get access to Democratic lawmakers, because Van Jones had half of the lawmakers in his pocket, whether he's reporting or not. So this is only also deep state. No one elected Van Jones into this position. The deep state is very difficult to identify, to pinpoint that someone is a member or not. But informally, everyone knows who is in and who is out in this whole informal society. And if you're not in, then it's very, very difficult for you to get ahead in Washington. So there's a saying that if you want to have a friend in Washington, you better buy a dog. The Beltway, Washington, all of these people, and so on. So that's deep state, so to say, and members of CIA and FBI and the National Security Council, different organizations, think tanks, legislation, media people, and so on. Difficult to define them exactly who they are, but this is how really the government is working. And let me tell you, this is in the US, so in Hungary as well. So there are people you never have heard of, but more influential than ministers and so on, who are in the forefront and on television and giving interviews, having all sorts of press conferences, and those are the people who have the phone number of the Prime Minister and of the Prime Minister's secretary. So there's a difference between the two.
Thank you. I should say the English have got two expressions which are useful here. One is the establishment, which is a less hostile version of deep state, and which is derived from Turkish military political practice. But the establishment is exactly as you described. And secondly, an expression, the great and the good, which is the kind of people who are invited to serve on royal commissions and government advisory agencies, and often have no, as you said, no official position, but maybe they're the head of, or the general secretary of a union, or the head of the engineering federation or something, but nonetheless carry weight in society. And I think the interesting thing is we now know, as a result of the Blair government in Britain, that both the establishment and the greater good can effectively be moved politically by a sufficient number of important appointments. It's against the spirit of both for a government to do that. But Blair did it, and I think the Tories are now going to have no chance, if they ever get back. Reform, if it gets in, will have to do the same thing, deliberately selecting people to change the political allegiance of the establishment. I hope from partisan to non-partisan, but it's more likely to be from left to right or whatever. Sorry about that. Next question. Charles.
Charles Kovacs. I don't have any credentials in the business, but I've studied American history and I've spent some time in Washington. And I'd like to ask about the deep state. I mean, let's stipulate that it exists in whatever form of life. But do you think that this is something that's a coordinated organization with some kind of a command structure, with some kind of a coordinated structure, or is it just the result of decades, and I'd say it goes back to the 1930s, not just of communist infiltration, but the way American history, the way American culture has, if you can say, evolved. And the result is that, for the last 50 years or 60 years, whatever, you had a generation after generation of young people being taught a kind of a leftist approach to everything. Now, I don't know, but I think two possibilities. It's either there is a command structure, or these are individual little cells that just go in and do their thing because they know what they should be doing, and here we are.
Perhaps I could begin by asking. Okay. Please go.
Oh, okay. So the answer to your question is yes. I had a strange experience, and that was when I was a civil servant in the Defense Department. When I was yanked out of the White House, I was put in a back office because they were trying to figure out, okay, we got rid of this guy, we took him out of the White House, let's now find something we can accuse him of. And one of the ways that they were sort of tormenting me was that they kept these are my accusers, they would disable my phone. They would disable my computer. I had a badge that this is the Department of Defense facility, a badge that I used to get in and out. They would disable that. And they kept playing these games with me. And one day, when they had disabled my computer, I had to call up the help desk and say, listen, my computer is not working again. They turned it back on, and it was a completely different screen. And I was like, well, this is very strange. They had given me access to the playbook, to the documents evidencing the conspiracy that they were executing against me. Very strange. This is what we're doing. We're accusing Adam Lovinger of this, and we got to hide that there's no evidence for it. And it was just an extraordinary thing. What I've learned is that the weapons, the bureaucratic weapons that they use to target certain people they don't like, these get used again and again and again and again. There's a real playbook here. And these offices that I mentioned, that are these nodes of the bureaucracy that have been captured, they do the same thing. They weaponize the federal investigative process in the same ways over and over again. Specifically when it comes to security clearances. Security clearances are the low-hanging fruit because you have no right to one. And it's purely administrative. You have no recourse under US law to the judiciary. The legislative branch keeps you at bay. So all of the power is in the executive branch, and it's all been corrupted. So this is what I saw firsthand. In the course of my trials and tribulations, other people have sent me information saying, this is what I get. The same thing happened to me. So you see these patterns over and over again. So I believe in the Trump administration, there's great clarity on which are the bad actors. Trump listed, he had a tweet before he joined office called "Draining the Swamp and Returning Power Back to the American People." And he listed 10 things to do. One thing was to disempower these bizarre offices called the Office of Inspector General. This is essentially the fox guarding the henhouse. These are executive branch agencies that are sort of tasked with oversight of the very agency that pays their salaries and pensions. This is an inherently corrupt concept. Inspectors general must be disbanded across the United States government. That power should be transferred to Congress where it belongs in our constitutional order.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another question. I'll just wrap up the deep state, by the way. We're saying it's in Tolstoy. In War and Peace, Andre is at a meeting between a general and a lieutenant or something. And in the discussion, the general defers to the lieutenant. The lieutenant is of a more noble family, and Tolstoy says, it was at once apparent to Andre that there existed two structures of authority in the army, the formal one and the one of social authority, which turned out to be more important. And I think that's often the case in armies which have not had a serious war for some time. A serious war then provokes a reconsideration of social promotion. Sorry, yes, I know that you've got the first question here. Where is the...
Oh, thank you, sir.
I've got one in the back.
I would like to move back to Barack Obama because it brings up fond memories. In 2008, I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. So I was living in Hyde Park, and the building elementary school next to me was where one of Obama's children was going to school. And if he would drive his daughter to school, there would be fans running after his car. So that made a big impression on me. What made less of an impression on me, it was also unfolding at the same time, maybe the 2008-2009 financial crisis. I was young, I was not in finance, so I didn't think too much of it. But after my time in the US, I went to China. Oh, by the way, I'm a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute, Academics, and I'm Dutch. And I went to China, and I talked to all these Dutch diplomats that told me that the mood among the Chinese elite had completely changed. America had lost a lot of its credit, not just figuratively, but also literally. And America now had a diminished reputation. Previously, a lot of people had looked up to America. Now, political elites, intellectual elites were rethinking the world and China's place within it. Now, it took some time for that new mentality to drip down to the universities and all the institutions in China. And it took also some time for political analysts and journalists in the West to figure out that there had been a change. So when they noticed the change, they misattributed the change to the Xi Jinping coming to office. They said this is Xi's new China. Actually, the transition in mentality, the more anti-Western trends that you saw in China came from around the period of the war response to the 2008 financial crisis. And in parallel, the mood shifted in Turkey and Russia. And why am I bringing this up? Because when you gave us your account of Barack Obama being perhaps less patriotic or more compromising or pro-American enough and giving in to this multipolar new world, I think you're just granting agency to the American side, and you're missing the picture that the rest of the world is responding to America. You're in the dialectic, and Barack Obama was facing a radically changed world in which America didn't have the prestige that it used to have just a few years earlier.
Yeah, I actually don't believe that. And you just have to look at his actions. Everything that Obama did from a national security standpoint, I'm not an economics expert like you are, but from a national security perspective, it was really an America Last policy that Obama was pursuing. We can go through the various ways, vis-a-vis Russia, gave Russia a free hand, certainly in Syria. He drew a red line that he didn't support. We had no freedom of operations, the deployments in the Western Pacific for the entirety of the Obama administration, normalizing Iran, the genocidal dictatorship that was at war with its freedom-loving people. I mean, sort of, you go down the list. One of the most insightful experiences I had was when I was transitioning from the Pentagon to the National Security Council after Trump had won. And I would get intelligence briefings every day. What I'm about to say is not classified, but it was from an intelligence briefing. And that was that once Trump won, America's enemies were very scared. The intelligence analysts thought that, they portrayed the internal discussions amongst the elites of America's enemies of Obama's on their side, the side of America's adversaries. Trump is this scary person who is not financially tied to America's enemies, has not been corrupted, is not part of the corruption that had developed over the years inside Washington, D.C. They couldn't control him. And it was extremely scary for America's enemies when Trump won. Back to your point about economics and the financial crisis. I'm not an expert, maybe you guys are, but I saw it from the national security perspective, and there was tremendous consistency in the DEI version of foreign policy under Obama.
Thank you. Look, I think we have to wrap it up. So I'm going to ask one last question from the back. I'm going to, be short. The question here, okay. And then I'm going to ask both speakers, Thomas, you first, and Milesh, to sum up entirely, and you have to address that last one. Yes.
All right, my name is Theo MacDonald. I'm a journalist based in Ireland. Just a question for Adam. On the weaponization of free speech that was alluded to in an earlier question, one of the things that stood out to me was the reorientation of the Global Engagement Center. I think it was initially led by Richard Stengel, away from combating extremism in the form of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of that, towards combating Russian disinformation and misinformation. A lot of this came out recently with the ending of USAID. So could you speak to sort of the weaponization of this whole kind of Russian disinformation narrative that was used to take away the freedom of speech of certain people, like Donald Trump. Like if Donald Trump were to propose a detente of sorts with Russia, he was accused of being some sort of Russian agent. Even regular citizens were accused of the same, and public figures of various stripes. If they suggested that somehow we should be less belligerent towards Russia, or acknowledge that they have legitimate concerns about NATO expansion or whatever, they were accused of somehow being a fifth column of sorts through some of these organizations like the Global Engagement Center. So could you speak to some of that if you could? Thank you.
Okay, well, let me just say that the two speakers are now going to have their final attempt to address it, as well as answering your question.
Yeah, so it's such a tricky thing. I mean, I think that, at the very beginning, I think that, as nations, the United States, Hungary, I think we need to have a very robust conversation about free speech and what it is. But perhaps the most important thing we should be doing, which I don't see much of, is really understanding how our enemies have weaponized it. I mean, to look at the tradecraft of Russian intelligence services, Chinese intelligence services, Iranian to a certain lesser extent, Qatar comes to mind, Al Jazeera. To look at their tradecraft, to have more Americans educate and Europeans and democratic peoples aware of how our adversaries conduct this sort of information warfare. Because I would say that most intelligent, educated people don't have any clue about this. And the strange thing about that is that the tactics, techniques, and procedures our adversaries employ to engage in information warfare are not so complex. They're rather limited. They don't have an infinite room of maneuver and tools. So there's a very strange lack of understanding of how we are being manipulated by our enemies. So that's number one. Number two, I'm a great supporter of the U.S. Constitution and the Federalist Papers and the wisdom of America's founders that we do need this robust debate. And we need to talk about this until we really understand. Because I mean, even in this room today, this talk today, I think there's, to me, we're sort of like almost talking past each other. What is free speech? I mean, it's not certainly from a legal standpoint, whether it's anti-Semitism at Harvard or whether it's, crying fire in a crowded movie theater. I mean, it's like these topics have really been looked at for many, many years, decades. And there's still, some misunderstanding of, what is free speech and why do we have it and how should we regulate it. So I just think that, overall that there's a lack of a more systemic, strategic approach to the speech and information warfare dimension that's lacking.
Thomas?
Yes, John asked me to be the first to make some final comments. So free speech, deep state, as I said, deep state is everywhere. So in each of the countries you have one deep state. Of course, the deep state in the US is much more interesting for us than the deep state in Kuala Lumpur or somewhere. Second, free speech, it needs to be adjusted and readjusted with technological advance. So as new technology is invented, you have to somehow adjust the framework and the rules of free speech. As for the Obama administration, I believe that Obama was the one who realized, one of the first ones to realize that the US has had overstretched itself. So too many commitments in the world, and that was the response to the neocons trying to spread democracy by force without limits. And he was also the one who realized the relative decline of the US power. I'm talking about relative decline, not absolute one. So still the US is number one in terms of the military and so on. But there are a couple of competitors who are growing very fast, especially China. And therefore, Obama came to the conclusion that the US couldn't be at present everywhere. As a matter of fact, speaking of Brzezinski, I talked about making priorities instead of trying to hold the front all over and globally. So, I think that is the sort of policy that has been going on ever since. And Trump, as I said, is trying to implement the same idea a little bit less politely than Obama, but trying to express the feeling that the US does have interest, and where the US has interest is going to protect them with as rigorous as possible. As a matter of fact, Marco Rubio, in his Senate hearing, said so that the US had to make priorities and cannot simply assume global commitments without any limits.
Have you spoken your last or?
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
In that case, sorry, I think my microphone was off. Look, this is a good point to end. First of all, it's been a very lively discussion, but it enables me, particularly the last few questions and answers, to advertise the fact that the Danube Institute later this year will be holding a conference on the two faces of disinformation, because disinformation in the Cold War was somewhat different and the answers to it are somewhat different to today. Today, the EU and other places tend to think that the answer to disinformation is to try to repress it, try to control it. I think if you go back to the Cold War, remember one of the major last battles for public opinion was the battle over whether or not America would be able to sight its missiles in Western Europe responding to the SS-20s. That was a major battle between the left on the one hand, supported by the Russians, but not the Soviets rather, but not entirely supplied by them. There was a genuine major section of opinion in Western Europe that strongly, the peace movement that strongly pressed, and it was defeated by a strong response. I mean, the arguments that were put by leaders like Helmut Kohl and Margaret Thatcher and the French President Mitterrand, they won the battle. I mean, it was clear at the time, so much so that one of the theoreticians of the peace movement, doing a post-mortem, said, when one of his colleagues said, well, really, this was a kind of a draw, the Cold War was a kind of a draw. He said, oh, really? Which former NATO members have now joined the Warsaw Pact? And it was clear who had won. So I don't think in dealing with disinformation, we should at all give up the idea that we can actually defeat campaigns of disinformation by campaigns of argument and truth and logic. And we should, and we have done so in the past. So we'll be doing it at the conference on the two faces of disinformation. I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you to the two speakers. I think it's been a tremendously lively afternoon. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Thomas.